how can you ensure you don't get insulin resistance? And if you do have it, then how can you reverse it? After this episode, you're going to learn what your blood sugar levels should be at baseline. You'll learn how much your blood sugar should increase after a meal. You'll learn 5 key things to reduce your blood sugar spikes around your meal times. And you'll learn her top 3 stress-reducing habits. And the second one, y'all, so good. If you're listening on the Apple Podcast app or on Spotify, make sure you hit the follow button. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit like and subscribe now because you don't want to miss out on any of the newest episodes to help optimize your health and your fitness. Excited to introduce you guys to Dr. Morgan Nolte. She is a board-certified geriatric clinical specialist and founder of Zivli. Her mission is to help adults prevent diabetes, dementia, heart disease, and all other conditions that are associated with insulin resistance. This is one of those heavy note-taking episodes. I'm just going to go ahead and let you know, if you struggle with weight loss or stress or lack of sleep, then get a pen and paper out and ready and get ready for your life to change. But for now, it's time to get closer and closer to your best you with Dr. Morgan Nolte. All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Best You podcast. Today, I am really excited to be joined by Dr. Morgan Nolte, and today we're going to talk mostly about insulin resistance, and I have the expert on insulin resistance here today. And to give you guys just a brief little introduction, and I'm sure Dr. Morgan will expand a little bit on this as well. Insulin resistance basically is a condition where the body doesn't respond properly to insulin, which is a hormone that helps glucose enters the cells of muscles, fat, and liver for energy. And when cells don't respond to insulin, then the pancreas produces more insulin to try to regulate the blood sugar levels, which can lead to excessive insulin levels and excessive blood sugar levels, which can lead to just a whole host of problems inside of the body. So with that being said, a lot of people who are our audience members of the podcast have heard this before. We've talked about this in some different episodes, not necessarily super extensively, so I'm really excited to dive into it today. But most people listening know that eating a bunch of processed carbohydrates and a lot of sugar-laden foods with artificial ingredients, all these kinds of things are going to be things that can lead to insulin resistance. But I want to start off by talking about some of the things that are not nutrition related that will lead to insulin resistance. So let's go ahead and start there.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and hope to add some value to your audience today. The non-nutrition things that would contribute to insulin resistance are stress, sleep deprivation, and physical inactivity. So when we're thinking about stress is not a bad thing. We need stress to live. We need our stress hormones, but excess stress, especially chronic stress over a long period of time, will lead to rising blood sugar levels. Because if you think about cortisol, what's the really job of cortisol, that fight or flight hormone? You want to fight or you want to flee. And so what happens when cortisol is released from stress is your blood sugar will go up so that available energy is in the bloodstream for your muscles to soak in when it's fighting or fleeing, right? But so many of our stressors today are either chronic sleep deprivation or emotional stress or relational stress, not things that require us to fight or flee. So then the blood glucose rises, but the muscles don't pull it in. So therefore insulin has to be released to allow it into the cell. Because there's only two ways that the glucose can get into a cell. It's either muscle demand or insulin. And so when your blood sugar rises, if you're not moving your body and using up that excess blood sugar, you're going to have a rise in your insulin, and high levels of insulin over a long period of time will contribute to insulin resistance. And I think it's really important to point out, especially for middle-aged women, stress management becomes critical. As you're going through those hormonal swings in perimenopause and into menopause, your adrenal glands become bigger estrogen producers. Essentially, your ovaries are shutting down the production of estrogen. But estrogen is important for so many things, not just reproduction. Our body loves estrogen for hair, nails, skin, bones, all the things, mood support, brain health. And so estrogen is important for your body to continue to produce at its highest capacity. And that after menopause, most of the estrogen is made in adipose tissue and your adrenal glands. And so your fat tissue or adipose becomes more valuable real estate following menopause because now it's producing estrogen and your ovaries aren't. and your adrenal glands. So if you are not managing your stress, if you're taxing your adrenal glands, if they're having to produce a ton of cortisol, well, that makes your fat tissue even more valuable real estate because your adrenal glands have a reduced capacity to make up that estrogen that the ovaries are no longer making. So I hear all the time of women saying, man, I went through menopause and I immediately gained 30 pounds. Well, a big part of that is the chronic sleep deprivation that women sometimes experience from hot flashes or sleep interruption from hormone swings. But then they're not managing their stress. They're in busy career. They might have adult children or grandchildren or aging parents. And so I think from an insulin resistance standpoint, recognize that going through menopause in and of itself will increase your insulin resistance and your cortisol levels. And so that's why women in their 50s, 60s, 70s are trying what they tried in their 30s and 40s and not seeing success because the same strategy will no longer work because your hormones have changed. So when we're talking about like things that contribute to insulin resistance, that's why I wanted to dive in on the stress first, because that's predominantly the biggest one that I see in the people that I coach.
Yeah, we'll get to the others here probably in a minute, but I want to make sure I understand this correctly. So you said when females go through menopause, then basically they produce estrogen through their adipose tissue or through their adrenal glands, but maybe because their adrenal glands have been wiped out and stressed out for so long, the adipose tissue becomes more valuable real estate. Does that mean when you say more valuable real estate, does that mean like your body wants to hold on to body fat so that it can actually produce the estrogen? And that's why people gain body fat through menopause?
Yeah, it's like the boardwalk on Monopoly, like the last property that you want to let go of because it's actually producing something that your body needs. And so if we can support our adrenals and reduce our stress and sleep, your body is going to be a lot more likely to release that fat because it's no longer as needed.
Okay, so let's go back to when we're stressed out, cortisol is released, and that essentially brings blood sugar in or brings sugar into the bloodstream because we think like, okay, we're stressed out, we're going to need that sort of energy. And then when we're not actually active, we're not actually fleeing anything, we're not actually fighting anything, what then happens to that blood sugar that has brought into the bloodstream when it doesn't get used? Is that then turned to body fat later on?
It could be likely if you're not using your muscles right away. So what happens, first of all, it's going to be stored as liver glycogen or muscle glycogen. And there is only a kind of a small storage quantity that we can use for our muscle glycogen or our liver glycogen. And then as those stores fill up, it's going to be shuttled off to fat tissue. So yes, eventually it will turn into fat if you're not using your muscles.
When it comes to, I'm a trainer, and I know that muscles are essentially like a glucose sink, a glucose storage site, and you use muscle glycogen when you're lifting and doing things like that. How much can you actually increase your available space for muscle glycogen? Like when it comes to building muscle, how much different is it for somebody who has a lot of muscle and does strength training versus somebody who doesn't? Like, is there a certain amount of like carbohydrates that you can almost get to that says that because this person has this much more muscle, they're able to absorb this much more sugar or carbs as muscle glycogen?
I don't know if there's a specific cutoff, just a general one, but what I would recommend people do is to get a continuous glucose monitor. If they want to measure their own personal carbohydrate tolerance, I think this is the best way to do it. And according to Levels Health, which is a CGM or continuous glucose monitoring company, we're really not supposed to have a blood sugar spike over 30 milligrams per deciliter from baseline before a meal. And so for people who aren't familiar with this, a continuous glucose monitor is a little circle device and it does not hurt. You just put it into the back of your arm or you can put it on your stomach and it syncs to your phone and it continuously measures your glucose levels in your body. And so it's fairly accurate. It depends on the brand. And so sometimes I have a little bit of a beef with them if they're not accurate or calibrated correctly. But from a carbohydrate tolerance standpoint, if you can eat a meal and keep that blood sugar spike under 30, like following the meal, that's going to be the first sign that that's the right amount of carbohydrates for you to eat at any given point of time with that activity level. So Another thing there is they really recommend blood sugar at any time stay under 110 to 115, which is a very tight blood sugar regulation, a lot more tight than what the American Diabetes Association recommends, which is like up in the 140 to 180 range after you eat. And so I think that when we're looking at the continuous glucose monitoring data, you want to look at those two things. So what's your post-meal blood glucose level? We want that to be under 110 or 115. And I think more importantly and more helpful, especially with variations in accuracy of CGMs, is that 30 milligrams per deciliter spike. So if you start your meal at 90, we don't want you to go above 120. So for me personally, it's about 30 grams of net carbohydrates that I can have before I see a blood sugar spike greater than 30. And I know that if I'm going to have more carbohydrates than that, I need to go for a walk after the meal. That always helps. Maybe I might do some apple cider vinegar before the meal to help mitigate that. So I do believe it's a little bit more person specific to figure out your carb threshold versus like a black and white answer on like, yes, if you gain 5 pounds of muscle mass, you're going to have this much more glycogen stores. That answer is probably out there. I'm just not familiar with it, but it is true that the more muscle mass you have, the more carbohydrates you can eat without an excessive rise in your glucose or insulin.
That's great. That's great. You just gave so many good things. I want to touch on a couple of them and regurgitate a couple of them. So she was talking about how ideally your blood sugar levels maybe always stay below that 110, 115 range. And then after a meal, you don't want it to spike over 30 above that. So if pre-meal it was 100, you wouldn't want it to go above 130 after the meal. And then she also talked about ways to manage your blood sugar spikes when it comes to a meal. Maybe after the meal, go for a walk. Maybe before the meal, have some apple cider vinegar. Now, we might touch on some more of that stuff as well, but obviously your level of insulin sensitivity and like your cellular health is going to impact your carb tolerance. Potentially the amount of muscle that you have is going to impact your carb tolerance. What are other factors that will influence the dramatization or the lack thereof of your blood sugar spike post-meal?
I think of sleep, honestly. So sleep deprivation has been shown in the research to directly impact your cell's insulin sensitivity or increase your likelihood for becoming insulin resistant. And I think everybody can think of a time where they had a poor night of sleep. And there's a couple things that happen. The first is you're going to have an increased carbohydrate craving the following day. And that's because sleep deprivation is a stress on the body. And when cortisol rises, it releases a substance called NPY, which preferentially makes you crave carbohydrates. So that's kind of the physiological reason why we crave carbs when we're sleep deprived. We want that instant energy that we didn't get from a good night of sleep. And then the second thing is your satiety or feeling of fullness is going to be reduced after a poor night of sleep. And so those two things combined are going to lead to overeating following a night of poor sleep, particularly overeating carbohydrates. And we know that that's the refined carbohydrates especially will spike the blood sugar and insulin response.
That's great. That's great. Super important to know how important sleep is for a lot of different reasons, but obviously just regarding blood sugar when it comes to that. What are some other things, walking after a meal, apple cider vinegar before a meal, is there any, I know fiber usually generally keeps blood sugar spikes to a minimum. Is there any other things that are simple to do that people could start doing today when they eat their next meal maybe, that will help to potentially reduce the blood sugar spike with the meal that they eat?
Yeah, a few things. So the first thing, aside from apple cider vinegar before the meal, make sure it's raw and unfiltered. You can change your meal order. So if you have a piece of steak and, half of a baked potato, maybe some avocado, if you eat in a certain order, it's going to affect your blood sugar response differently. So I would suggest having any starches or sugars at the end of your meal. Have the non-starchy vegetables or whatever fiber you're having first, then having the protein and fat, and then having the starches and sugars. And I like to say it's like rolling out the red carpet for the starches. So you're kind of lining your gut and you're giving it some nutrients that help slow the digestion and absorption of those carbohydrates that you're eating. Another one of my favorite hacks is to refrigerate potatoes before eating them. And that actually changes the configuration of the starch. Not to get too technical, it goes from like being a branch, almost like a tree. This is the configuration of starch where there's all that glucose. It's kind of shaped like a tree and like a potato that you just cook. And these enzymes that digest the glucose, they can chew it up right away. Like think of like little Pac-Men eating up all the glucose. And so what happens then is when you refrigerate your potatoes after cooking them before eating them, the starch actually reconfigures itself to a straight line. And then there's only two ends that those enzymes can chew up that glucose. So like this summer, if you're going to make a potato salad, first off, watch the portion size, but second off, like make it the day before, put the potatoes in the refrigerator the night before. Same thing goes with rice. It has a similar effect. I think being very mindful of portion sizes. I don't think that this is talked about enough. You can still overeat low insulin foods and struggle with high blood sugars. And one of my clients recently, he's very diabetic and very like does not want to go on medications. Totally respect that. And he's eating very low carbohydrate, but his blood sugars were being very stubborn to come down. And I asked him to log his food for a week so that I could see what he was eating, portion sizes and everything. And I realized he's way overeating protein. And so there's a huge emphasis right now on a high protein diet, protein, protein, protein. Completely agree. However, there's a limit on how much protein your body can use at one time. And that is about, in my research, 50 to 60 grams-ish, depending on how much muscle mass you have. And so for him, he was, going 80, 90 grams of protein at a time. And I said, those portion sizes are too big and your body is not using all of that protein right away. And we don't really have a great storage capacity for those amino acids in the protein. So your body turns the protein into glucose. So even if you're overeating protein, if you don't need it right away, your body's going to turn it into glucose. And I think that was what was really keeping him stuck at blood sugars that were higher than what he wanted. So for protein, I typically recommend like 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight a day, not like what people think is realistic, but what is ideal. So if you're looking at a BMI chart, you can just look up BMI chart, go to the green zone for your height and weight, and then err on like the mid to lower side of that green zone. And that should be how many grams of protein we recommend getting in a day, but pace them throughout the day. You don't want like this huge influx of protein. Otherwise, you're still going to have a blood sugar response to that, even if it's elongated. So you might not see it right away. Most people don't see that blood sugar spike right away, but they're going to notice kind of a rise in their baseline for a few hours after a super high protein meal that's overdosed, I like to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So watching portion sizes is important too.
Great. Just to touch on a couple of the things that you mentioned. First off, this is so good. I never heard the refrigerated the potato things or refrigerating rice things. So like, for example, I haven't eaten lunch yet. After the interview, I'm going to go eat lunch. And I had already cooked some sweet potatoes, but then I have them in a glassware container in the fridge. But then I was planning on like microwaving it up afterwards. Does that, because I refrigerated it before, does that still help do what you said it was going to do? Or does the microwaving it undo it?
I've heard different things on that. So I would want to look that one up before I'd answer it because I have heard different things.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. And then the other thing, when it comes to the meal order, I personally hear the fiber first, protein and fat, and eat starches last. So many of my meals, it's kind of like a bowl or everything's together. Is that maybe the second best thing to do, to have it kind of all together at the same time? Or talk to me about comparing the two.
Yeah, so if you're looking at a good, better, best situation here, it's definitely going to be best to have all of those starches and sugars at the end. But I don't know about you. I kind of like to do a little bit throughout my meal. Yeah. So I try to start a little bit with the veg, but if you're going to put it in a bowl, that's going to be a better solution because you're having it all together versus having all of the starch or potato at the beginning of the meal, which unfortunately in our country, so many people do that, right? You go to a restaurant and what do they bring you? They bring you a bread basket. Yeah. And so people are starting their meal with a bunch of carbs And that's the exact opposite of what we want to do for blood sugar. We want to end the meal with carbs in a appropriate amount, which is difficult to do when you're eating out.
Yeah, wow, that's so true. That's so true. I know that you also talk about there are certain medications. So, we talked about their stress, sleep deprivation, physical inactivity. We touched on at least the first two a decent amount. But I want to kind of dive into how you say there are certain medications that can lead to insulin resistance. What are some of those ones that are maybe relatively popular that people wouldn't know that lead to insulin resistance?
Well, and it's sad because some of them are misprescribed, in my opinion, and others are prescribed to fix a problem or a symptom of insulin resistance, and it's making the problem worse. So, an example of that would be some blood pressure medications, a lot of the beta blockers, so like metoprolol, atenolol, if it ends in OLOL, it's a beta blocker. It's probably contributing to insulin resistance. And high blood pressure is a symptom of insulin resistance. Sometimes that's the first clinical symptom of it. And it's very commonly overlooked by physicians where they don't even check your fasting insulin level. Another one would be some antipsychotic medications commonly used for like depression or anxiety. And I'd have to look them up specifically, but if somebody has a certain medication and they want to know the effects, just be like, does insert medication name raise blood sugar? And because not a lot of people talk about its effect on insulin resistance, but if it raises blood sugar, it will raise your insulin resistance. And unfortunately, I had a really, really good interview with Dr. Georgia Ede on my podcast, and she's the author of Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. She's a psychiatrist and a nutritional psychiatrist. And so she talks about central insulin resistance in the brain and how our current diet really contributes to depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, all of these neurological things that she treats in practice. And it talks about the importance of keeping our blood insulin levels low and our blood glucose levels low so that we can maintain good brain glucose and brain insulin levels. And so for her, talking about one problem and then you have a medication that makes that problem worse. Yeah, insulin resistance in the brain can cause depression and anxiety. So then they're taking an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication that makes their insulin resistance worse. And I think that that's really important. A lot of times when we're talking about diet and exercise and all this, we think about the physical body and we don't think enough about how is our diet affecting our mental health, because that is so important too. And this mental health really affects one's ability to follow through on any dietary plan or exercise plan. So they really work hand in hand. And the last one would be statins. And this is one that I consider to be overprescribed. There are many excellent resources online about statins and how they contribute to insulin resistance. And my problem with statins is that physicians are prescribing statins based on total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And there is ample evidence now to support that those really mean nothing when it comes to our risk for cardiovascular disease. And furthermore, they're trying to lower the calculated LDL cholesterol. The cholesterol is not the problem. Cholesterol is not a problem. Your body makes cholesterol. Your brain makes cholesterol. There is cholesterol in every single cell membrane of your body. And so we have this false assumption that high cholesterol levels cause heart attacks or they clog your arteries. That's not true. The evidence is very, very supportive of this. What is a problem is the LDL particle numbers. So when I say LDL particle, that's like the boat carrying the cholesterol and the triglycerides and everything to your cells. And so what I would really encourage people to do if they have high total cholesterol or if they have high LDL cholesterol and their physician is like, oh, here's, simvastatin or atorvastatin, your cholesterol is high, we need to bring that down. What I would encourage them to do is dig a little bit deeper, get an NMR lipoprofile test. I think last I looked, it was under $80 online, and they can order that. And what that gives them is the information of how many LDL particles do I have, and what is the size of those LDL particles? Because how much cholesterol you have really does not matter. It's about the particles carrying the cholesterol. And with those, we want large LDL particles. So think about like a beach ball versus a golf ball on the inside of your arteries. If you have beach balls floating around, those are going to be a lot less damaging to your blood vessels than the small golf balls, right? So think about like snow versus hail coming down on your roof. Which one's going to do more damage? So large LDL particles is what we want, but we also want few LDL particles, not a lot of LDL particles. And you can't get that information from a standard blood panel. You just can't. They're not testing anything about your particles. They're only checking the calculated cholesterol within the particles, and prescribing a medication by that is just, I think it's nearing malpractice these days. But obviously that's still the standard of practice. So my opinion is in the minority. And then I think the other thing that people really need to be aware of is LP little a. And LP little a is a genetic risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And it essentially increases the likelihood that the LDL particles are going to become atherogenic. And so, you know, the NMR lipoprofile test, that will test the size and the number of LDL particles. That will change with dietary interventions. You change your diet, you change your activity levels, those are going to see improvements. But your LP little a is a genetic risk factor. It's not going to change with lifestyle interventions to the best of our knowledge. And this is where you hear about young, active people having a heart attack. They likely have high LP little a, and it increased their clotting risk in the first place. So the other thing that I really suggest people getting checked from a medication standpoint would be HSCRP, which checks low-grade chronic inflammation. And a lot of people who have like rheumatoid arthritis, they have high levels of inflammation, a lot of times contributed by their dietary patterns. And so those types of medications for autoimmune conditions can also increase one's risk for insulin resistance. So you want to keep an eye on the inflammation marker too.
Okay, gotcha, man. So much stuff great there. Maybe some blood pressure medications that are beta blockers in particular. Maybe some antipsychotic medications like depression medications, anxiety medications, and just Googling, does the name of your medication raise blood sugar, some statins, and really appreciate the conversation on cholesterol. I think that the more and more people hear that, the more and more they understand it and grasp it, and it's just such an important myth to bust and thing to be aware of. I kind of want to dive into what reversing insulin resistance really means and what it looks like. So it's kind of my understanding that when you're insulin resistant, your cells, like in your cell membranes, are not what's the word I'm looking for? Permeable enough, or so for glucose to be able to enter the cell. So when insulin is there, the cell itself is not healthy enough for glucose to be able to enter. So it's like a cellular health issue. And I correct me if I'm wrong there. But what does it actually look like or mean for insulin resistance to be reversed? Like what actually has to happen from a biological or maybe cellular level?
Yeah, well, you're correct in that, where the cells just lose their sensitivity to the insulin. And so the glucose, I don't know if it's like the GLUT4 transporter is like tuning out insulin and it's not going up to the cell membrane like it should, and then glucose isn't coming in. I'd have to look up the specific pathological means, and my guess is it varies cell by cell. So every single cell on your body has an insulin receptor, and it's probably going to look different in the liver than it does in fat tissue, and in muscles than it does in your brain. That physiological mechanism behind that cellular level. But what it looks like to reverse insulin resistance, what it takes to reverse it, is to improve that cellular insulin sensitivity. And what we focus on is a low insulin, first of all, but also low inflammation lifestyle. So it's important to note that inflammation drives high levels of insulin, and high levels of insulin are inflammatory. So it's the cycle that goes around and around. So if we're only paying attention to blood sugar and insulin levels, we're going to be missing this boat on inflammation. And that's where like the seed oils come into play, right? Because seed oils like canola oil, soybean oil, stuff that's in nearly every condiment, nearly every processed food, those are highly, highly inflammatory to your cells. But you're not going to see a direct rise in your blood glucose or your blood insulin levels because it's a fat. And fats have minimal impact on blood glucose and insulin. And that's one nutrient, but the other is fructose. So we've all heard of like the glycemic index of food, right? Diabetics especially are probably told to eat low glycemic index foods. It's just an index about how much a food will spike your blood sugar. Well, guess what sugar they're checking in the blood? They're checking your blood glucose. So what they're really checking is, how does this potato or this piece of bread or this apple, how does that impact my blood glucose level? Well, we're completely overlooking fructose. And fructose is the sugar that's found naturally in fruit. Some vegetables might have some, and it's not really in grains. So pasta, rice, most breads have added sugar these days, but like the starchy components of the grains that make the breads, they don't have any fructose. Those are just molecules of glucose strung together. And so if you're only relying on like the glycemic index to figure out if a food's good for you or not, you're missing fructose. And this is the issue. So the glucose that you eat, that can be metabolized by any cell in your body, any single cell, your muscle, your liver, your thigh, your brain, all of that works. But for fructose, that is almost exclusively metabolized in the liver. And the liver has a very limited capacity to process fructose. So when you have like agave or honey, for example, those actually are higher in fructose than table sugar. They're going to have a lower glycemic impact than table sugar, but they are directly contributing to insulin resistance in the liver if you have them in excess. So things like bananas are very high in fructose. Certain fruits are high. So I think that's a really important conversation to have about like sneaky things that are causing insulin resistance that we think are healthy, but it's actually too much fructose, and you're not necessarily going to see that on a continuous glucose monitor if you're just checking your fasting glucose. And so when it comes to reversing insulin resistance, lowering those high insulin foods, lowering fructose, lowering the seed oils, those are going to be three really, really important things. We have to support the liver, because there's a debate too on like, where does insulin resistance really start? Some people think that it starts in the fat cells. Some people think that it starts in the liver. I don't really care where it starts. The intervention doesn't change. We got to keep those carbohydrates low, especially if you're not active. Not necessarily carnivore or ketogenic, but got to figure out, how are we going to reduce the carbohydrates from all foods, not just the processed and refined foods, but from all foods. Like Weight Watchers has done such a disservice by making fruits and vegetables free, because they are not free. They are definitely not. And then how do we reduce like added sugars, specifically high fructose corn syrup, added sugars? Those have got to come down. And then refined seed oils, like I talked about, a lot of processed food, anything fried will have a ton of inflammatory oils in them. French fries, chicken strips. I'm breaking people's hearts right now, but just being blunt. So I think that's a good start, is focusing on the carbohydrates, the added sugar, and the refined seed oils for reversing it.
Well, let's go just a little bit deeper into the fructose, into the fruit standpoint, because I think, like, I've heard some people talk about fruit and too much fructose, and that can be bad for you. And I'm kind of on the camp of like, I've never really seen fruit make anybody fat or make anybody unhealthy. So talk to me just a little bit more around where you stand on fruit, what its role is, or fruit, how much is maybe too much, or if it's maybe worse for some people than other people. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I'm not anti like fruit at all. I eat fruit. I think it depends on the degree of insulin resistance and the person's capacity for change. So I always try to meet somebody where they're at when I'm giving recommendations. If they have a standard American diet and they are like eating 300 grams of carbohydrates a day, primarily from hamburgers, French fries, chicken nuggets, those kinds of things, I'm like, let's get you some fruit. At least the fruit doesn't have the processed seed oils and all of that inflammatory stuff in it. But if somebody's really trying to dial things in and maybe they're already having a mostly whole foods diet, that's maybe when I'm going to be like, well, let's see how much fruit you're eating. And if they're having like 2 bananas and an apple a day, I'm going to say, well, let's try to reduce the portion sizes of that and increase the portion sizes of fruits that are higher in fiber and
Yeah.
lower in sugar, like strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, or increase the portion sizes of a non-starchy vegetable. So I think that it's a really nuanced,
Right.
individualized conversation about where they're starting and then what their goals are and their degree of insulin resistance.
And would there be a reason for, I guess it just depends on the insulin sensitivity of your liver cells, but I guess some people are just going to be able to metabolize the fructose more readily than other people, therefore making maybe people like who are closer to insulin resistance or insulin resistant, fruit is worse for them than for somebody who is insulin sensitive in their liver cells.
That is, yeah, for sure the degree of insulin resistance, but also those things that we talked about already, like having the fruit at the end of the meal, that's going to
Mm.
help slow the digestion and absorption because your intestines can absorb about, from what I've read, 4 to 5 grams of fructose. And there's more than that in a banana, right? So if we could reduce that portion size, but think about like a Pepsi has about 20 grams of fructose, maybe even a little bit more if it's high fructose corn syrup, about 20 grams of glucose. So if your intestines can only metabolize like 4 to 5 grams, the rest of that 15 grams is heading straight to the liver, and that's going to be converted into liver fat. So this is a huge problem. This non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is primarily caused by an excessive consumption of fructose.
Gotcha. That's good stuff. Well, the way I want to finish today is going back to the stress conversation. I think that everybody knows who's listening to this episode that stress is a problem and that stress is readily experienced by so many people out there. And a lot of people on this episode experience stress to a high degree and stuff like that. And, you know, they hear an episode like this and they're like, crap, I'm stressed and I'm stressed out even more about my stress. And I think that sometimes more traditional, let's say, stress reduction practices like meditation, journaling, breath work, etc., are some good things to do. I also think that sometimes adding something else to do to reduce your stress, and you could be stressed out about getting those things done, therefore it like amplifies the stress. So the question is, in your experience, what are some of the best ways that you've done or seen or worked with people to help reduce chronic and excessive stress?
Yeah, honestly, a morning routine is clutch. I think if you can do a morning and evening routine, that's really beneficial. But the morning routine that I suggest is creating some sort of like wellness vision statement for your life. I call it a personal faith formula. And that has, how do you want to show up in the day? What's your, like, who are you? So mine is a lot like, I expand in abundance, love, and success every day. I am a patient, calm, intentional, and present mom, loving and supportive wife, and successful business owner. All these things, like all these positive affirmations that I want to become my reality, I am telling myself, I am feeding my brain positivity and intention first thing in the morning. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not watching the news. And I practice gratitude. So the higher vibrational state we can get, the better our mood will be, the lower our stress will be. And practicing gratitude is one of the simplest ways to really raise those vibrations of thought and get you out of that stressed out thought loop. And this is hard for people. Like it is a practice to practice gratitude.
Yeah.
And it will get easier, but gratitude. And then I think recognizing your wins for the day. So you asked me before we started recording, like, what's something that made you happy today? Like just thinking about that kind of stuff is important to help reduce your stress. And then something that I have found to be very beneficial for me is doing an evening routine as well and looking ahead at the next day and seeing what are my action items, my goal achieving action items for the following day. It's always a morning routine. It's always some form of exercise. It's always an evening routine. And then like this podcast was on there and business meetings were on there. And then I think about, okay, does someone have a birthday tomorrow that I need to remember to call them? Like I have a good calendar system. And so I think that sometimes I want to follow up on this, by the way. I have another really important thing to say. But when you plan your day the night before, you wake up with intention and a plan, and you're not just like laying in bed because you have nothing to do and nothing to get up for. but it also really reduces your errors and your chances of missing something, which causes more stress. So I think that's one thing that people can implement is a morning routine to raise their mental vibrations, to practice gratitude, to recognize their own wins, and an evening routine to plan their next day so that they have a clear instruction set for themselves to follow. And it reduces the chance for rework, errors, more stress down the road. But I'll tell you another thing that has really helped with my stress is being a minimalist. Like, I don't think people talk about this enough, man. I think that I probably have like less than 30 shirts in my like nice shirts. I don't like having a lot of stuff because having a lot of stuff, first of all, it stresses out your environment. Like if your environment is dirty, I think the external is always a reflection of the internal. So whenever my home gets messy or my car gets messy, I know I'm kind of messy inside and I need to fix that. But go through your closet. Like this is so simple. Go through your closet and throw away anything that you haven't worn in 6 months or anything that doesn't bring you joy. Go through your house and figure out, do I like that? Or am I just keeping that because grandma gave that to me and she's dead now. She's not even gonna know if I throw it away. So I think I've coached people before where they're like, I don't want to cook at home because my home is a mess. My kitchen is a mess and I'm just going to add to that mess by cooking. So they just eat out all the time. So I think that thinking about how can we minimize our stuff? How can we minimize our schedule? How can we block our time so that we are incorporating joyful activities and rest into our day is important. And if you haven't done this yet, I highly suggest that you think about and actually write down your ideal week or like an ideal day, but I prefer week. That way you can kind of see your rhythm of life. Write out what time do you get up? What time do you start work? When are you exercising? When are you doing something fun? When is your family time? Because when you proactively know your priorities and your values, it's a lot easier to live those out. And I think a lot of people just don't take the time or they don't know to take the time to ask themselves, well, what are my values? What are my priorities? How am I using my time? Because we can't manage our time. We have to manage our activities. We all have the same amount of time. And so when you get very clear about what's important to you, then you can say confidently yes or no to an opportunity. Like I said no to a speaking opportunity recently because it's on the weekends. And I replied back, I said, I prioritize time with my family on the weekends. If this opportunity comes up during the work week, let me know. But I think that people are saying yes to so many things that they don't want to say yes to because they're just like their default. So I personally believe that no should be the default because every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to someone else or something else, and usually it's yourself. So getting very clear about how we manage our activities and intentionality behind those activities, that is going to massively reduce somebody's stress.
You guys need to rewind about the last 7 or 8 minutes because that was an amazing way to finish the episode, and I'm super glad that we ended up going there. That was absolutely amazing. You guys need to go follow Dr. Morgan Nolte on Instagram at Dr. Morgan Nolte. You can go to her website at www.zivli.com. She also has a great YouTube page that will have all that stuff linked up in the show notes. But is there another good place where people should go learn more about you and follow you?
I don't know if you mentioned my podcast. It's Reshape Your Health with Dr. Morgan Nolte. If they're already listening to podcasts and you like it, it's I have a lot of just experts on, kind of like you do, but also some solo episodes, a lot of mindset coaching on there. So there's also that.
Beautiful. Reshape Your Health. Nice. Awesome. Well, I hope you guys learned a ton today. I know I did. I have front and back pages of notes about blood sugar levels, how stress impacts them, how food impacts them, where your blood sugars level should be, how you want to make sure that they don't spike above a certain number, how to actually do things with your meal before and after your meal to reduce your blood sugar levels, how to reverse insulin resistance, how to reduce stress, just so many great things here. So make sure you took notes and you can start to put this stuff into action. But Dr. Morgan Nolte, this was an absolute blast. I know everybody learned a ton. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
I appreciate you having me on. Thanks, Nick.
What an informative episode today with Morgan. I hope you guys took notes and I hope you have some things that you can implement and start putting into action today. Remember, if you're on Spotify or on Apple Podcast app, make sure you hit the follow button. You guys need to get notified when these episodes are coming out because you're not going to want to miss the latest health and fitness tips in order to get you closer to the best version of yourself. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit like and subscribe as well. We're going to continue to bring the best content out there. My three biggest takeaways from Dr. Nolte are the following. Number one, you can reduce your blood sugar spikes around your meal times by just doing some simple things like going on a post-meal walk, having apple cider vinegar before your meals, changing up your meal order and how you consume it, and refrigerating your starches prior to consumption. Number two, it's not just insulin that needs to be paid attention to in order to reverse insulin resistance, but it's also your inflammation levels in your body and your fructose intake. And the third and finally, some of the best things that you can do to reduce stress is form a good morning routine, a good evening routine, and I loved this one, become a minimalist, both with things and with your schedule. I loved this conversation with Dr. Nolte today. We did a deep dive that was super educational around blood sugar and insulin resistance, and then we finished it off with a bang when discussing stress. If you can implement some of these things, there is no doubt that you'll get closer to the healthiest version of yourself and ultimately closer to your best you.